everyone. As Marcus said, my name is Miro. I teach over at MIT Sloan in our business school in management communications. My primary focus, the classes that I teach are on data communications, but today is more about a prior life that I'm excited to dip back into, which is I spent most of my career in technology, most of it in high growth startups. I was involved in two companies, two companies that IPO'd, one company that was acquired, and then one startup that I founded, outcome TBD still. I dropped out of college to join my first startup, which was a company called VarsityBooks.com that had the brilliant idea of selling textbooks over the internet. It was the 90s. It was amazing. I was employee 20. That company raised $40 million, went up to 200 employees, had an IPO. It was the last IPO for 9 months on any US public market. It was like the crash. The stock made a single trade above its offering price, crashed down into the penny stocks, was delisted. We laid off between layoff and attrition, 180 of those 200 people left. And I was number 20 again, and that's when and that all happened in 20 months, just to give you a sense. So I tell my students, great if you can get that one in early in your career, where it's a little less harrowing. So that was my first big startup experience. Since then I've worked for HubSpot, worked for a company called Compete that did data analytics online, and I co-founded an education technology company called Testive. Most of my time in my career in those companies was in sales and client service, and so that's where this series comes out of, which was as someone who had a technical training prior to school, in school that there was actually a bunch of technical aspects of sales that I found really valuable and some training on it that I thought was useful. So this series is designed as an introduction to sales particularly for people who may have come out of engineering and technical disciplines and are entirely new to sales and their role in it, as a way to give you some frameworks and some basic understanding of the steps involved. If you have a prior background in sales, much of this will be familiar and hopefully pretty rudimentary, but I'm hopeful that for you it can be a chance to reinforce some of those core basic skills that are really important. So what we'll go through today in the first part of the series, this is by far out of the series the most theoretical of all the classes. We're going to talk about buyer personas today. And this is a tool that I found really helpful to think about how you allocate your most precious sales resource, which is your time. How do you think about where you're going to spend your time? And it's my belief that there's a whole bunch of tactical and logistical skills within sales, but the major choice that you're making is where your time goes. Our other classes will get more tactical, but I thought this is the theoretical background for me that's been really helpful through my work, and particularly for the enterprise sales that most of you are doing. So we're going to talk about personas and an idea of three major personas when we're working with enterprise customers. One of them is the buyer. This is sometimes called in some frameworks the economic buyer. And this is the person who makes the buying decision, the person who actually buys the product. Notably separate, and as a different persona, is the user. So this is the person, day to day, who's interacting with whatever the product or service is, the person who uses it. And then the third persona we're going to look at is the reviewer. The reviewer is the person who has some influence on the buying decision. The general thing that makes somebody a reviewer is that they have the power to say no and to kill the sale, but they do not have the power to say yes. If they want the sale to go through, that is not sufficient for the sale to close. But if they say no, that is sufficient usually to shut the sale down. In consumer products, sometimes all three of these are the same person. So the easiest one is apps. Apps that we buy for our phone that are $2, we play all of these roles. We are both the buyer and the user for them. Part of why enterprise sales gets complicated is that these roles start to split into multiple people, often with different odds at each other. And so the example that I want to go through first is an example from the company that I founded, which is Testiv. Testiv is an education technology company that helps students prep for the SAT and the ACT, so the American exams that you take for entrance into college. And it's a service that pairs a student with a human tutor over the internet. They do their work online on an online portal, and they meet with this tutor over video chat. And the tutor actually doesn't convey content, primarily supports keeping them on task, making sure they do the work. So I'm going to go through this example, and I'm asking people to think about this. Who do you I'll do hands just because I now spend a lot of time in classrooms, so apologies, I'm more used to it. Who do you think would be the buyer in this scenario? In buying test prep, who's the buyer?
Parents.
Parents. So almost everyone says parents. There is more specifically one type of parent who is the buyer. In Testiv's experience, 80% of the time. I'll throw it back to you. Who do you think is the buyer? Yeah, so the mother is almost always the buyer for test preparation. It's enough of an issue that if a salesperson gets a father on the phone, there is like a conversation with the manager about, do you actually have the buyer? And in the cases where a father is, it's like a notable point of discussion around the office, like, oh, a father bought today. It's that unusual. It's almost always the mother that's buying this product. Who's the user? Ryan, I'll go to you just for.
Student?
Yeah, the student, right. So, the student, very clear. All right, so mother buys the product, decides on it. Student is the one who's going to use it day to day. Who do you think the reviewer is then?
The teacher.
So this is for this is for a home product that people buy outside of school.
Peers.
Say again?
Peers.
Peers. So generally, since the mother is buying, it's not usually the student's peers.
I was thinking more social media.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a great example of that influence on it. That might be an influencer on the mother, but there's actually a person who can say, who doesn't usually say no. Sorry, doesn't say yes, but can say no. The father. It's almost always in test prep that the father plays the role of the reviewer. We are stereotyping here, clearly. We are taking an experience that has variation between people, and we're looking at some common trends across it in order to be able to think about, okay, how should we allocate our time to move that sales dial from a sale that's 40% likely to 60% likely? So what are some of the things that you imagine the mother would care about in this? And this is where I'm going to go back to you because social media and influencers are important here. What are some things you imagine the mother cares about in a test prep sale? When evaluating, okay, I'm going to do prep, I want to pay somebody, what are some things that would matter?
Well, they would want to know if other kids liked this service.
Yeah.
And also if they did well, like some kind of data.
Yeah, so do kids like this? Other kids. Did others do well? And by well, just to be really specific on it, what does well mean in this context?
Our scores improved
Yep.
as a result of.
Yeah, exactly. So just want to get really mechanical here because this is going to become important in a second. So why do they care if other kids like it? Actually, let's do that one. Why do they care if other kids like it? Why is that important?
Do the kids actually use it?
Yeah. So the liking it drives a, will my child do this? What about, did other people's scores improve? Why is that important? Effectiveness, yep. All right. Because what's the core thing that you're trying to buy here? What's the promise that you're buying with test preparation?
Higher test scores.
Yeah, okay, so right, that my student is going to get higher test scores. So the biggest thing that we're caring about here is, will my student get higher scores? So imagine this with your product. People are coming, and their fundamental question is this going to be effective? Is this product going to do the thing that it says it does? And with test scores, the answer that you always, so you're fighting this thing in sales, which is people are like, well, is it going to work for me? And your real answer is, I don't know. That's in the future. I have no way to predict that. There's this huge number of variables about whether or not it'll work, which is essentially true of all products, that we don't know for sure if it's going to work in the future. So you start looking for these kind of signals of, is the value that you promised me going to do it? And these are all signals that try and get at that. Well, if other kids like it, that's an assumption that if other kids like it, my student will do it, and if they do it, it will work. Did it work for other people? There's an assumption about whether or not it will work for me. So this idea of, does it work? Really important to the buyer. Does it deliver the returns that are promised? High priority to the buyer. What about as a student? What do you imagine are some of the things, someone will run through some of the things you think a student would be interested in if you're like, we're considering this test prep here?
Time commitment.
Time commitment. Yeah, how long is this going to take? What else?
Ease of use.
Ease of use. And what does ease of use mean in this context? What do you think?
The learning curve for the product.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay, is the tech easy?
Who would we get paired with for their tutor?
Yeah, and what do you think they care about specifically on the tutor?
They probably want someone that's maybe a little like close in age to them or older, but they want someone they can relate to.
Yeah. So the way this usually comes up is the tutor nice? Are they nice? Why does the student care about whether or not the tutor's nice?
They become easily relatable.
Yeah, they become relatable. And why? What if they're not? What's the problem if they're not relatable? What happens to the student?
They disengage, they won't use it.
Yeah. It's not a fun experience. Like, it's not fun if the person isn't nice. I'm asking as a yes or no, but we'll dive into it. Does the mother care if it's fun? No. Now, that's the general response. This is correct. It doesn't care if it's fun. The key thing on this is people would say, well, maybe, right? Because there's this idea of that it's not fun. Will my child use this? But what if I told you this is guaranteed to be effective and not fun? Which one would you trade? Right? Because this person cares about the effectiveness of the product. But the user tends to care about the usability of the experience. Imagine going to the student and saying, I have something that's guaranteed to work. It's going to take you 45 hours a week. It's going to take you a week just to learn how to use it, and we're going to put you on with a drill sergeant of a person who is going to berate you and grind you down every single week in order to get those results. The student might say, can we pick an option that is less guaranteed to work, that might be a better experience for me? Because these people care a lot about the experience and not the effect in the same way. What do you imagine in most of these scenarios the dad tends to care about? There's one number one thing. Was it? Yes. Yeah. And this is common generally across reviewers. Reviewers are traditionally the people who care about the price.
If the mom is happy.
If the mom is happy. That is an unusual dad reviewer phenomenon that is not as common in organizations, though it can be. Depending on how senior this person is and how important they are, their happiness may or may not matter to the reviewer. So, buyers tend to care about effect. Users tend to care about the experience. Reviewers care about other things. Money's the most obvious one in this case, but we'll talk about a couple of others. A question.
Why do you think the buyer does not care about the price?
All right. So, and I'm going to reframe that a little bit, because I asked about why do you think the buyer cares less about the price than this person does? Or actually, I'm going to frame it a different way. In what way how is the buyer evaluating price?
ROI.
ROI. So the buyer cares about, is this price going to get me the return that I want? So it's not necessarily, it does end up that they look like they care less. Because if the return is good enough for the price that they're paying, that's of value to the buyer. The reviewer tends to be the person who just looks at the overall budget, and so the absolute number tends to be much more important to them. Other questions before we draw this into the corporate world? All right, so we've got buyers who care about the effect and the ROI and the return. We have users who care about the experience and the usability. And then we have reviewers who can say no but can't say yes. I'm going to pass these around if you could. Extend this out to the corporate environment. Who are some of the reviewers in a corporate environment? Who are some of the people who can say no to deals but can't say yes? Do what?
Purchasing, procurement.
Procurement. What are some of the things that procurement cares about?
Money.
Money. What else?
Engineers.
Engineers. Give me a specific scenario, because sometimes engineers might be the users or the buyers. Give me a scenario where they're the reviewers.
Sometimes the engineers need to review the technology,
Yep.
whether they have some like internal development doing the similar stuff.
Yeah. So usually the engineers in this case, we're thinking of IT departments. If you have a product, you might have, because engineers, all of these reviewers could be in different things, right? There's a product for procurement. You might be selling a product for procurement where all of a sudden procurement cares about ROI, whereas on everything else they care about like price and that. So IT cares about things like compliance. Compliance with technology. What else? Legal. What does legal care about?
That technology is not compliant with certain GDPR, certain legal things that they can't even bring in-house.
Yeah, so legal cares about compliance. One of the phenomenons in organizations is there's a few buyers. There tends to be a larger number of users. And there tends to be, depending on how big the organization is, a lot of different reviewers that all have different standards that they're holding to. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask you to take a moment to think about this for your organizations and your companies. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to take 5 minutes, and what's easiest to do on this one is to think about a couple of successful deals or successful organizations that you've closed. Some of you may be early stages where you don't necessarily have this, but it's easiest to do this with a successful a successful deal, because you tend to get more insight once the deal is closed into exactly how the dynamics worked. And to start to think for your organization about, I'll just hand this one for a second. So who are the kind of people who are buyers for your product? And then what are the things that they tend to care about? Separately, who are the users for your product or service? And what are the things that they care about? And you could spend a lot of time on reviewers, spend some time, but not a ton. Who are the reviewers that you tend to run into? And what do they care about? What I'm going to ask you to do is take 5 minutes to think through this on your own. And then we're going to get into groups of 3. I'm going to ask you to get into groups with people not from your company and to share with each other. And to share with each other, first you'll say what your product is and give a little bit about your company, and to talk about these different roles and talk through the things they care about. And then as you share with each other, start to look for common things or things that maybe jogged in your memory of like, oh yeah, that's actually a thing my group cares about as well. So take 5 minutes to think about this on your own. Then I'm going to ask you to get in groups of 3, and we'll spend some time sharing with each other as I come around.
If they're not using a lot of fuel for all the voyages, that's like, benefit to the company at the end of the year.
Yep.
And that's like, where they get their bonus.
Okay. So in this case, these folks are saying it's very specifically tied to compensation.
Yes.
So there's a very specific economic reward for this group in this particular case. And so they care about the things that drive their compensation. I want to know if there's a lot of other things probably involved in managing a fleet well that they may not be compensated on. So that these things matter. Who's the user in this case?
The user are the captain and people on the bridge.
Yeah. And what do they care about?
They care about safety mostly. And they will also be judged a little bit on like how much fuel they used, or like being late at work. But to me, like it's mostly just a safety issue that everybody's safe.
Yeah. So this is like it's like they got their crews. They're like, I do not like if my I will spend any amount of fuel to keep my crew safe. Yes, it's important. It's important for the business, and you always see this. Like these are the people who think about the business. These people think about what is their day-to-day life like. How does it impact how they work and the people they work with? And then who are the reviewers in this business?
Well, then it's like comes down to again purchasing.
Yep.
The legal, because like we're putting basically autonomy where there's no legal frame to have it, and then like ship owners, like managers that want or don't want to have that.
Interesting. The owner. There's a little bit of talk here on reviewers. Maybe I just don't understand. So these fleets, do the owners work for?
It's the other way around. Like the managers work for the owner.
Got it. Okay. So there's an important note on reviewers here. There was a thing that people were. It's like that. What defines a reviewer is that they cannot say yes. So the way to think about a reviewer versus a buyer is, and this may or may not be the case here, but that for a reviewer, that if everyone else in the organization were to say no, and for some unusual reason, this person were to say, despite all of those people, I want to go forward, that this thing would still happen. That's what separates a reviewer. So a CEO might literally review a contract, but a CEO is almost never a reviewer. Or actually, it's basically never a reviewer, because if the CEO says, despite what everyone else says, I want to go forward, this thing happens. Now, in reality, it's not that black and white. If everyone else says, this is a terrible idea, most CEOs are usually convinced, but it's critical that not always. So that's why I want to push on the owners here, that if an owner wanted this, would that be enough for this to happen, even if the fleet manager and the captain said no?
Probably would still happen. So I guess like.
Yeah, and so that's my flag there, right? Is just because someone's involved in the approval process doesn't necessarily make them a reviewer in terms of this framework. And we're going to see why that's important in a second, because there's different ways that we need to think about a person who solely has the power to say yes versus a person who only has the power to say no. What were some other things that folks saw that their buyers cared about? And tell us a little bit about the organization and who the buyer is.
Satya, I work at a company called Tulip Interfaces, and we help manufacturing facilities with their manual processes and help digitize those manual processes. And so one thing other than this list, what our buyers care about, who are manufacturing engineers, QA/QC engineers, plant GMs and whatnot. They care about the implementation time of how long they will take to implement within their facility.
Okay, and why? Because I will say that's an unusual thing for buyers to care about. What is it about this thing that implementation time is so important for them?
Just because their processes are just working and they're making a lot of money at the moment.
Yep.
So like moving to like digital 4.0 it does take some time, and we need to go back and look at all of their data and documents and stuff, and kind of making uniform.
And what is the burden? So what I'm hearing is that there's a really big cost to implementing this.
Yeah.
That they have to,
for some organizations.
yeah. So things that buyers tend to care about. They tend to care about economic return. They tend to care about efficiency in terms of cost. So this is one of the things. We often have products that are good for the users that make the user feel more efficient, But that's a different kind of efficiency than a buyer tends to care about. So I was surprised to hear that as a buyer issue, but it would make sense to me as a buyer issue if, oh, anytime we have to pause our processes, that affects our profitability directly. I'd be like, oh, okay, I see why that's a buyer issue. Do you want to talk about, we talked a little bit about buyer issues in your situation.
Sure. So I'm with Brain Power.
Yeah.
We're a research and tech company. We write software for Google Glass that teaches behavioral and life skills to kids on the autism spectrum. Sort of an interesting buyer user reviewer system to work primarily with schools.
The public education buyer reviewer user system is a cluster.
Yeah.
So
It's it's fun because, particularly because there are probably 3 or 4 levels of bureaucracy between buyers and reviewers and users. Like the users are kids in the classroom on the autism spectrum, and other than that, teachers who have very little direct input into like superintendent level decisions. So the buyers in this case are usually superintendent schools, and what they're interested in is a lot of the time like legitimacy and proven track record.
yeah,
Because like reviewer concerns obviously are like budget. Like that's a huge thing. It's a
Yeah.
public school district. Indirectly, like will our teachers be able to use this? But not teachers who are reviewing it directly, because you can't just get all the teachers and pull them. So credibility and our ability to sort of preemptively address those concerns are really big for buyers, because they don't want to take a stab at it and then find out later, okay, this actually just doesn't work in our system.
Yeah.
Because in a large public
Yeah.
bureaucracy, pulling the trigger on something that will not roll out effectively can be both cost and time intensive.
yeah,
So reputation and proven track record is something that's really good for buyers, because they have to kind of trust our previous track record to address potential reviewer concerns. Apart from budget, like budget
Yeah.
is
yeah.
really the main
Yeah.
hard reviewer issue.
Yeah, and I want to actually just separate a little bit from, usually these folks aren't as concerned about reviewers, but there's a specific situation going on here. And part of your search in creating these businesses is to tease out these situations. You have superintendents where, I'm sorry, what's your name again?
Corey.
What Corey was pointing out is like, oh, to implement anything in a public education system is this enormously complex process. There's not an equivalent of like fail fast. So all of a sudden, your ability to do implementation becomes really important in that industry in a way that usually implementation is a thing that IT cares about and is a reviewer issue. So things will float between industries. I'm going to argue that teachers are not reviewers in most educational purchases because they actually don't have the power to say no. Teachers have very little power outside of their individual classrooms.
As in their concern is represented indirectly. As in, will our teachers be able to? Will our teachers actually be able to learn this? And
Yeah.
implement it? But they're not asked directly,
Yeah.
so their input is sort of generalized or simulated.
Yep. And I want us to push to be really honest about like that. I think one of the honest things we have to think about sales in, is it really that important to the sale? I see a lot of it. So actually, here's a good example. Textbooks and CDs. Those of you who were in school in the 90s will remember there was a period of time where there were textbooks in CDs. Those textbooks were never used in any classroom. I'm sorry. Those CDs were never used in any classroom anywhere by anyone that I've ever met. There's a buyer-user issue. So the users, the teachers, those were not designed for. If you did put in one of those CDs, okay, I once did it one place to see what it was like, and they were terrible. They were not made for teachers and for the classrooms. They were made because the buyer in this case were state boards of education. And state boards of education had mandated that there has to be technology along with the textbooks that we buy. And the textbook makers made a rational decision, which is this is a buyer need that we are going to meet. And so I'll actually submit to you that they made a rational choice to make to make a product that was designed to meet the needs of buyers, which was to check off this need for a CD, and quite frankly didn't meet the needs of users, which was teachers. And I'm actually going to argue to you that that was a rational choice to make. There weren't enough computers in the classroom. There wasn't enough understanding of how this technology worked. The teachers were never going to use this product. It was rational to just build it good enough to meet the buyer needs. And so I want us to push us in sales to be really honest and not lie to ourselves about who we want to think is important, which is basically always this person. How many people in here, their initial product, as you discussed it, your initial product was built for a user, and then later on you started building features for the buyer as you discovered who that was? All right, it's like a really common phenomenon that people go into. We tend to design for these folks. What are some other questions that came up? Or other things that people noticed? Got one from online here.
So this is how do these dynamics change when it's less of a traditional sales cycle? What is being discussed is a relatively very low commitment pilot project, potentially without a monetary value. Goes on to say, however, it is a pilot of very novel technology. Pilot users have no real frame of reference. Very innovative / disruptive to the extreme.
All right, so I'm interpreting, do we have a,
Well, so I would think the implementation
yeah.
is the most important part of that, because that's basically what you're going to use to then sell to that customer once the pilot is done. So all they really care about is how well did you do for me on that last job?
Yep.
Yeah, we encountered that a little bit because we're trying to implement Google Glass in a public school setting, which, if you can't figure out CDs in classrooms consistently, then it sometimes can be a hard sell to say, yeah, we swear we can teach teachers across your district how to use Google Glass with kids on the autism spectrum less. So yeah, having a very clear implementation plan and track record as well is something we should. Like not only here's our plan for how we're going to roll this out, step by step. We're going to support you the whole way through, and also we have done it successfully in a couple other places before. So getting those early successes and using those as references as models is something that's been really big for us.
Can someone talk to a pilot, either successful or not, and how it mapped against these groups? What you did in a pilot that addressed any of these groups? Actually, we've heard from you already. Someone else we haven't heard from yet. Oh, so they're going to make me go back to you. I can stand here for a good long time.
Sure. So I work for a company called Companion MX.
Yep.
We have a digital solution for measuring behavior for mental health patients. So the pilot that we started off was really focused for our product. Our users are a combination of clinicians and patients.
All right, so clinicians and patients, the users.
Yep.
Yep.
Our buyers are the chief medical officer or the head of the department.
Yep.
Our head of innovation sometimes, to some extent, in that sequence of priority. The reviewers are similar. So you have general counsel, IT, purchasing.
All right.
So the fundamental struggle that I think we had originally was we were very focused on the user.
Yep.
But the piece in healthcare is the user is the important. Nobody really cares about the user that much.
This is one of the unfortunate discoveries of this process, is that is often true.
Yeah. So unless you can pay for it, and the buyers care about A, can they pay for it?
Yeah.
B, can they save money from it?
Yep.
Which closely relates to ROI, right?
Yep. So talk about how pilots go wrong then,
So
or right.
KPI design
Yeah.
to begin with. So if you design the KPIs strictly along the user, you'll have a lot of very happy users, and then they will commiserate with you. And
they will commiserate with you over the fact that, we should have bought that product,
That's exactly right.
but we didn't.
That's in fact my first startup. Exactly, that's what happened. We burned all our money. It's a microfinance startup.
Yep.
And we burned all our money on appeasing the user. The user went with us to the board meeting saying this is amazing, and the buyer said thank you.
Yep. So when you're thinking of pilots, no matter how innovative, and just in general design, we tend to want to design for these people.
Yeah.
We tend to want to design for them. We tend to want to design for them in the product And when we do pilots, we tend to want to design for them with the idea that if the users are happy, then, oh gosh, these people have got to come along as the next step. But part of the reason to do this exercise is to realize these people's needs are actually fully different. And they often don't overlap with each other. So if you're just designing for these people, you will not be able to sell to these people. And so if you remember nothing else today, to remember the importance of designing in your product and in your sales cycle and in your pilots for the needs of this person, because this is what decides whether or not you get purchased. These people have an influence, but I would say don't overestimate them, because almost all of you are already aligned with this group. Almost all of you already have a pretty good sense of this group. The way people fail is they don't spend enough time designing for this. So design for buyers. And designing for buyers is harder because it has all of these things that are in the future. Savings, efficiency, economic returns, things that are really hard to demonstrate over the course of a pilot. So we tend to design for them. We don't design for them enough. And then there is another problem, which is the reviewers. Someone talk to us about their reviewers and all of the headaches they cause in life. We talked about this over there. You want to run us through some of your reviewers and the pain in the ass that they are?
Yeah, well, some of them that have come up is that, and we've made this, is that the reviewer has no stake in the game if something were to happen to the user or to even from the buyer standpoint, for the reason why the buyer would buy it, because it's two different pockets of money. So an outcome would occur. The reviewer who said no has no stake in the game, so that's really disjointing.
Yep. So almost by definition, they are a reviewer because the outcome of the product does not affect them. That's almost by definition what makes them a reviewer. If they had stake in the game, they would start to care about these things much more, and these things would be enough to convince them. But they don't. They have another problem, which is that they also have a lot of time on their hands to be able to ask you for more information. So there's a third problem, which is a tendency not so much to design, but to spend your time appeasing them. And what I want you to think about for the reviewers is think about this idea of, this is a phrase introduced to me recently, I've never used this here, minimum credible effort, which is what is the least amount you can do that is still credible, that you're actually doing something. And that's going to change over the life of your company. When you start out early on, so I worked in a company called Compete. We analyzed online behavior, and one of our reviewers was the research group at companies. And they actually wanted to check on our methodology. And when we were an early stage company, we just really appealed to ROI and like, look, we have metrics that are going to let you figure out your online behavior, which is going to let you sell more online. And the purchase price was small enough that these folks could be overcome. As we expanded the business and our purchase price got bigger and bigger into the hundreds of thousands and millions, we had to put in more energy to explaining how our methodology worked, how we kept in compliance with things. But you don't want to spend too much energy here. Because here's the dynamic. You may have had this experience before, where something is stuck in legal, let's say, and what's the thing that moves it out of legal? Someone experienced something stuck in legal and how they got it out?
Hire your own legal team.
What was that? So you could hire your own legal team and sue them. For those of you who have the resources to do this, I am not clear why you're here. Congratulations. Very rich.
We have experience of being stuck in legal until a CEO got involved.
Yeah. So this is almost what always gets it out of legal. Right? I was saying the CEO got involved. These people, you can get out of them with one call often from this person. So think about, is it better spent 3 days of work to try and get this person to make one 10-minute call that will get this out of legal, or 3 days of work trying to respond to the needs of legal that might not result in it happening at all? So again, an argument here for why it's critically important to think about what the needs of the buyer are.
I want to ask a question.
Yeah.
We're finding that we have buyer and viewer kind of looking at each other a lot.
Yep.
We offer a service that helps people access patient data.
Yep.
Huge legal,
Yeah.
regulatory risks, or private data, anything
Yeah.
that's corporate and private. And so how can we get them to where they're not looking at each other?
Yeah. So Ryan's talking about they have an issue with patient data. So this is one of the cases where these folks do also, buyers can also care about compliance at a certain level. And this is a case where I think buyers actually do care about compliance because the legal penalties are so high. One of the other folks who does a training product, and everyone's saying, oh, the only manager training we ever got was sexual harassment training. And the reason for that is because the legal burden and risk of not doing that training is so high. So buyers can care about compliance issues. And this is one where I don't know the industry, but the framework that I'm running it through is that actually a reviewer issue? Or in this in this particular case, is that actually a buyer issue? Because compliance is something you worry about at potentially like the CMO and the CEO level at hospitals. I think maybe. Were we on until 2:30 or 3?
3 o'clock.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, 2:30.
All right. We're at 2:15, so we're good. So I think on this one, it's potential that that's a buyer issue, which may mean one of the things about buyer issues is they take a lot of time to create very small amounts of resources often. Doing like an ROI calculation. I mean, that could be an entire pilot study to generate that. But it is worth the time to invest in these people because you've probably heard of many successful companies where they had a great product and the company failed. It is very hard to have a product that sells really well, but the company doesn't succeed. That's usually mismanagement. There's a lot fewer examples where you thought, oh, that company was great at selling their product, but they didn't do well. Usually that is sort of the definition of doing well. What else? What are some other things that came up or other questions people had that we can work through with this?
In the situation that are the users the buyers?
So this, I'm taking this as, are there situations where the users are the buyers? So there are situations where users are the buyers when the price is very, very low. Not usually in corporate situations, usually in consumer situations. So the example of a phone app. You are both the buyer and the user of that. And in cases where the buyers and the users are the same, you'll notice design gets really good because usability is really important. So when everyone asks, like, why are the apps on my iPhone so good and like the $1 million software we use at my company is so shitty? Well, because the user and the buyer are the same thing, so they demand really good design, where when you split those people, all of a sudden, as you're learning, the energy has to go here. And this is much better than it used to be, by the way. Like 20, 30 years ago, these were terrible because these folks were totally irrelevant. As prices have come down, you've seen much better design things. Still not great, because they're not the same person.
In that situation where
Yeah.
isn't user experience necessary for scalability, even like in a corporate situation,
Yeah.
in order to influence the buyer?
Yeah. So I can, is this necessary for scalability? It can sometimes make it sound like, there's two things. I can sometimes make it sound like these people don't talk to each other. They clearly do. And the influence of these people is important. What I'm suggesting here is that we tend to overvalue these people and think that, oh, if we can convince them, their influence will be enough to carry these people. And I'm arguing, no, these things have to be true for these people to be convinced, and this is an influence on them. It's an influence especially in the sense of, if I believe that the adoption of this product is going to drive one of these, then its usability is really, really important. But that you have to believe one of these in order for it. And what people are often is like, oh, what if I made a product that was so good that there was a groundswell of support from the users for it? I'm going to say, that does happen. It's a lot harder to build a company that way, because here you have to convince a large number of people of the greatness of your product, and here you only have to convince one or a small number. So there's a couple of exceptional examples where we've seen this, but it's very unusual.
I think this case might be an exception, but what do you do if the ROI is not really clear. Like in the case of a security product, where when you try to prevent something that has a low likely chance of happening, and the outcome is you save a life, right? So what can you do to put ROI?
How many people have a product where they think like a solid mathematical ROI is hard to prove? Usually, so I was expecting more hands. I think it can be, this is often the case that it's hard to prove. So there's two things on here. What do you do when ROI is hard to prove? Well, one is it's potentially worth a tremendous amount of energy to prove this out, is a general one. Like, that it's potentially worth a lot of time and energy just to be able to get to that, even if you have to make assumptions and fake things. That's one part of it. The other part of it is, what are the other things the buyer cares about? So if you truly have something where you cannot demonstrate to a buyer that the value for this is greater than the cost, then you will not be able to sell it. Sometimes you can do that through a mathematical equation. Products that have clear savings are easier. Products that generate clear revenue are easier. Products that address low likelihood situations are harder. I would first push you to quantify the value of that low likelihood situation. This will cost you $1 billion. If it happens, this happens to 0.5% of companies. So your expected cost of this is either $1 billion or zero technically, but mathematically it would be $10 million. This is a $100,000 product to insure against a $1 billion thing. So you can do some of it, and then to think about what are the other things the buyers care about. What are some other things the buyers care about in your case besides just mathematical return?
Being in the medium.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. So there's a great example, right? Which is like, okay, so maybe you're not going to sell on mathematical ROI. Maybe you're going to sell on media risk. And this is the media risk to the company of anything showing up. What else?
Is having a reviewer in the sales process always a burden, or can that be an asset too?
Is having a reviewer a burden? Can it be an asset? On the rare cases where the reviewer is on your side, it can be an asset. Generally, their job is so much to cover their asses that, like, look, should a reviewer come along and be really enthusiastic about your product? Great. The mistake that I see people make is, let's give one here. IT says, oh, if we approve a product, that makes the decision around here. Unless it is a product being bought for IT, don't believe them. So better if they're on their side. You'll actually get this almost anyways. Whenever you ask anyone, oh, who's the decision maker for this? Me is almost always the answer that you're going to get. So this is why we do this, to get really clear about who, when they say the decision maker, really is the decision maker. What else?
So I think I agree with the fact that this is from a user, from our experience. That So we did the pilot with the user. They were very pleased with the results.
Yep.
And the CTO is our buyer, so they were also on board because they obviously were able to influence them. But then when it went to the review stage, the budgeting kind of came into question, and they had a budget, and so for us to kind of like fit into that, we had to start cutting features, which started hurting the user because they were like, hey, we want a display, we want like some other electronic features, and so this process, kept looping around, which I mean, it took 6 months to kind of like get to that. So I'm not sure like what would be like a good strategy trying to like cut short this.
Yeah, so you're talking about a process where it looped around, where there wasn't enough budget, and you had to cut features, and eventually it's hard to get within the value for this. You said that took 6 months. So one of the first things that I thought when you said that was, wow, only 6 months. That's actually pretty good for an enterprise sales cycle. There's one of the issues on budget. There's two parts of it. One is one is the dollar value of the budget, and then the other is the timing and the cycle. And to separate those issues a little bit, there is an issue of we don't have budget for this. That could either mean we don't have enough dollars, or we don't have it now because this is so big that this doesn't fit into our current cycle. You can skip things through the cycle if you have a powerful enough buyer with a high enough ROI, because these people care about it.
How would you do that?
How do you do that? You'd have to have something so powerful. So what would be an example here? Sorry, the product again prevents against, it was a security product you said?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so a case where there has just been a security breach at this company, and they're in the public right now with bad press, and they need to do something to show that they are addressing that. All of a sudden, the ROI for this shoots through the roof. The perceived ROI for this shoots through the roof, and it does not matter what budget cycle you're on, you will spend the money. So that's an example of like an external shock that does that. Most of them I see are external shocks. Or there is some pressure on this person that is so great that, and they have enough clout to be able to short circuit the budget cycle. Again, though, it always comes down to, is the value to this person high enough? And that's the critical part. The reason the ROI becomes so high when there's a security breach for the CEO is that all of a sudden the spotlight is on the CEO for that security breach. And it becomes, the ROI to them becomes very important. The actual underlying security problem is unchanged from what it was 2.5 weeks ago. The risk to the business is frankly unchanged, largely from what it was 2.5 weeks ago. But the value, because it's changed for them. So with high enough ROI, you can always short circuit it, but don't underestimate how high it has to be. And look, we have time. We'll take one more, and then I can stick around for a while afterwards for other questions.
So users and reviewers, the distinction here is for helping us identify, like peel out reviewers to the people who don't have skin in the game and can still say no. But what if you have a lot of people who peripherally use the product and like kind of have some power to say no?
Yeah. So you say, what if you have a lot of people who peripherally have the power to, like, a lot of people who are peripherally users / reviewers? This is really common, that this list is actually the longest list. And it's part of why the important thing is to not get your time sucked into here too much and to spend this focus on here, because they have the power to overcome these. And the more of your products, the more divisions they cross, the more complicated this tends to be, which is why I'm going to do this thing that I hate it when speakers do, which is suggest things that are unbelievably difficult and complicated to do and have an enormous expense. My apologies. Why you see a lot of products created that target just single departments, and that it's hard for early stage companies, harder to get in for products that are cross-departmentally, because it means you have to go up higher on here and you have more of these people to convince. And so it's just harder to do that when you have a smaller sales cycle and you can't have larger sales times. So things to think about are, can you find a buyer who has an ROI? Can you start designing features and focus in on one group or department where you have less interconnectivity so that you can get the ROI really high for one person? Once you get in the organization, it's easier to expand from that point. So, key things for today. You have 3 distinct personas, buyers, users, and reviewers, that have 3 different sets of needs and issues that they want. And you want to think about going into meetings differently with them, providing information and sales material for them differently, and even designing your product differently for them. And while the temptation is to focus on the user, you want to be super clear as you move into a focus on sales about who this person is and what they care about, to make sure that not all of your design and sales energy go to them, but at least equal to, if not disproportionately more than the users, because the decision is made here, and that you're going to need to have sales and features for this person simply to make the sale happen. And that if you can get this person on your side, it unlocks these other 2 in a way that these other 2 don't necessarily unlock this person. And the key to that, which is this thing we're going to just keep talking about the whole time through this series, is about identifying pain. That to some degree the job of a startup is to figure out what is the pain that this person has, how does that cascade through the organization, and how do we think about what are the processes that give us access to this person and convince them that we're able to address their pain. So our next session is
Wednesday, October 30th.
Is October 30th. We're going to talk there, I believe, about funnels. So how we think about moving, so this is going to be For those of you with sales experience, this is going to be a very basic session, but important, which is what is the funnel, and how do you think about creating one for your company in order to, as you iterate through this sales process, to get smarter about it. I'll stick around for a while to have questions for anyone else, but thanks for coming out today. It's always such a pleasure to get to work through this, to hear about companies, and I hope I'll see some of you in October.